Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. The discharge papers from my surgery were still warm in my hand when I noticed them. 5 black garbage bags were lined up neatly against the wrought iron gate, standing there like silent guards announcing rejection. My son Kevin stood nearby with his wife Lauren, both wearing the same mildly inconvenienced expressions I had seen them use when discussing expired milk. Lauren spoke with that carefully practiced sweetness she used on difficult customers at her boutique, and explained that I was getting too old, and that it was time for me to live somewhere else. If you are watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. I stood there for a long moment, fresh from gallbladder surgery, staring at my entire life packed into trash bags. The irony was impossible to miss. At 68 years old, I had apparently become the garbage. Still, there is something important about being thrown away. Sometimes it is exactly the kick you need to wake up. I looked at Kevin, the son I had raised alone after his father died, the boy I had put through college by working double shifts at the diner, the same Kevin who had moved into my house 18 months earlier because his startup was struggling with cash flow. It was almost laughable how his financial problems had somehow turned into my housing crisis. I said calmly that if this was how they felt, then I suppose that settled it. My voice was steady as stone. I smiled, but it was not the broken smile of someone defeated. It was the quiet smile of a woman who had just realized something important. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. She had clearly expected tears, pleading, maybe even a dramatic breakdown that would ease her conscience. Instead, I walked to my Honda Civic, opened the trunk, and began placing the bags inside. Kevin tried to stop me, saying that I should wait and listen because there were things he needed to explain. I silenced him with a look and told him there was no need for explanations, that they had made their position perfectly clear. As I lifted the last bag, I noticed how surprisingly light 40 years of accumulated possessions felt once someone else decided what was worth keeping. When I drove away, I saw them in my rearview mirror. Lauren was already pulling out her phone, most likely texting her friends to announce that the mother-in-law problem had finally been handled. Kevin stood there looking like a man who had won a battle but was not entirely sure he wanted the war. There is nothing quite like the guilt of throwing your own mother away to cast a shadow over a perfectly good afternoon of playing house in someone else's paid-off property. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a furnished studio apartment I had rented by the month, going through my new reality one garbage bag at a time. That was when I found it, buried under a stack of old sweaters Lauren had considered too outdated even to donate. It was a business card I had forgotten I owned, given to me by Catherine Holloway at the hospital gift shop where I had been volunteering. Catherine was the woman who had started her own company at 72, and had become a millionaire by 75. That story could wait. For now I had planning to do. 3 days after my son had thrown me away like yesterday's newspaper, I was sitting across from Catherine Holloway in her corner office, watching her pour tea from a delicate service that likely cost more than Kevin's monthly rent. She looked at me through her designer frames, her blue eyes sharp as broken glass, and told me gently but directly that I looked terrible. I laughed, truly laughed, and explained that this was what happens when your own family decides you are past your expiration date. I told her everything. The garbage bags by the gate, Lauren's dismissive tone, Kevin's cowardice. Catherine listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft humming sounds that I knew meant she was calculating. When I finished, she asked how much money I had. I told her that I had about $30,000 in savings and that the house had been paid off. Then I corrected myself bitterly and said that Kevin had been living there rent-free for 18 months. Legally, my name was still on the deed for now. I could almost see the wheels turning in Catherine's head. She had built her empire by buying struggling businesses and turning them into gold mines. The look she gave me now was likely the same one she had once given those failing companies. She leaned forward with the focus of a general planning a siege and explained what we were going to do. First, I would stop feeling sorry for myself. Second, I would allow myself to become truly angry. Third, I would let her teach me how to turn that anger into cold, hard cash. I remarked that at least someone believed my rage had commercial potential. Then I reminded her that I was 68 years old, that I had never run a business. I had worked in a diner for 30 years and volunteered at the hospital gift shop. She responded by asking how many customers I had served during those 30 years, how many problems I had solved, and how many difficult people I had managed, and she did not wait for an answer. Running a business is not rocket science, Diane. It comes down to understanding what people need and finding a way to give it to them better than anyone else can. As she said this, she pulled out a leather portfolio and slid it across the desk, explaining that she had been searching for someone to partner with on a project, someone with my particular background. Inside, I found photographs of a rundown strip mall. Food service, she clarified. But not just any kind. Comfort food. Real comfort food. The kind desperate people willingly pay premium prices for when they are too exhausted or too busy to cook. I asked if she wanted me to open a restaurant. She corrected me and said she wanted me to start a revolution. Her smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. She asked who knew comfort food better than someone who had spent 30 years serving it. She pointed out that no one understands customer service quite like someone who has handled hungry truckers at 3 in the morning. And she added that few people are more motivated than someone who feels she has nothing left to lose. The proposal itself was elegant in its simplicity. Catherine would provide the startup capital and business guidance. I would bring the operational expertise and the sweat equity. Once she recovered her initial investment, the profits would be split 60-40 in my favor. There was one condition, and it made my smile turn predatory. We would not be opening just anywhere. The location would be directly across the street from Lauren's precious boutique. Catherine poured more tea and suggested we discuss how to make my son very, very sorry. I had to admit, I was beginning to appreciate her definition of business strategy. The next morning, I drove to my old house to collect the mail they had been too thoughtful to forward. Kevin's Tesla was gone, likely at his office, which was really just a shared workspace where he spent most of his time playing ping pong with other unemployed millennials who called themselves entrepreneurs. Lauren's Range Rover sat in the driveway, gleaming white, far brighter than her conscience. I used my key, assuming it might be the last time. The house already smelled different. Some expensive candle Lauren burned filled the air, the kind that gave me a headache. If I had to guess the scent, I would call it vanilla narcissism. The mail was stacked on the kitchen counter, mixed in with their bills, as if they had lived here for years instead of months. Most of it was junk, but one envelope made my heart skip, the property tax assessment. I opened it immediately. My name was still on everything after all. The house I had bought for $60,000 30 years ago was now assessed at $420,000. I had no idea. Lauren called my name from upstairs, her voice sharp with surprise and something that might have been guilt. She appeared at the top of the staircase wearing yoga pants and a sports bra, looking exactly like the social media influencer she aspired to be. Because nothing says serious businesswoman like workout clothes during a hostile takeover of someone else's home. She demanded to know what I was doing there. I replied pleasantly that I was collecting my mail, waving the tax bill slightly, and mentioned how surprised I was to discover that I remained responsible for property taxes on a house I supposedly did not live in anymore. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face. She insisted they were handling the paperwork and that Kevin had promised to take care of everything. I responded that Kevin had always been excellent at taking care of things, especially when those things belonged to other people, much like the way he had handled informing me that I was being evicted. Such a considerate son. Lauren descended the stairs slowly, like a cat approaching a potentially dangerous dog, and suggested there had been a misunderstanding. She claimed they simply believed I would be happier somewhere more suitable for someone my age. The classic approach. When you cannot defend your actions, you call them a misunderstanding. I clarified that perhaps she meant somewhere Kevin would not have to look at me and remember that his startup was failing while his 68-year-old mother was paying his bills. That landed exactly as intended. Her composure cracked just enough for me to see the calculation underneath. She insisted it was not about money. I glanced around my living room, noting how they had rearranged the furniture and hung their own artwork on my walls. I asked how long this little intervention had been in the works, whether it started before they moved in or after they realized how convenient it was to let someone else pay the mortgage while they played house. She claimed they had never asked me to do any of it. I replied that family rarely needs to ask. They simply take what they need and assume the other person will understand. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Since my name was still on the deed, I informed her that I would be making a few changes, beginning with documentation. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of their belongings, the modifications to my house, and the clear assumption that they belonged there. She demanded to know what I was doing. I answered sweetly that I was gathering documentation for my lawyer. It turns out there are quite a few legal options when it comes to people who have been living in your house without a lease agreement. I left her standing there, mouth open, likely calculating how quickly they could afford a security deposit on their own place. The drive to Catherine's office lasted 20 minutes, and was the most satisfying 20 minutes I had experienced in months. But when I stepped into her building, I realized she was not alone. A tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit was shaking her hand as I approached. Catherine looked up, smiled, and said that my timing was perfect. She introduced me to Adrian Cole, and explained that he was the owner of the strip mall we had discussed the previous day. Adrian turned toward me with a smile that probably could have undone women 40 years younger without much effort. He greeted me warmly and said that Catherine had told him I would be their new anchor tenant. When our eyes met, there was a spark, subtle but unmistakable. This situation was becoming far more interesting than I had expected. Adrian Cole had the kind of voice that could make something as simple as ordering coffee sound intimate. It was smooth and deep, with just enough of a southern accent to suggest polished manners and expensive bourbon. While Catherine walked him through our business plan, spreading blueprints across the conference table, I found myself noticing details, especially his hands. There was no wedding ring, but a faint pale mark where one had clearly been. Recent divorce, I would have wagered my last dollar. Catherine explained that the location offered high foot traffic, convenient parking, and exactly the demographic we were targeting: busy professionals, overwhelmed parents, people who wanted quality food without pretension. Adrian nodded, though his attention kept drifting back to me. He asked about my experience in the restaurant industry. I explained that I had spent 30 years serving food to people who had not eaten in 10 hours and had been driving for 12. I added that if I could keep truckers satisfied at 3 in the morning with a hot meal and a steady smile, then suburban soccer parents would hardly intimidate me. He laughed. A genuine laugh. Not the polite one people use when they are unsure whether a joke is appropriate. He told Catherine that he liked me and said I had grit. Catherine murmured that he had no idea, giving me a look that suggested she was fully aware of the week I had endured. Adrian leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully, like a man accustomed to building fortunes by reading people correctly. He asked whether he could call me Diane, and wanted to know what had made me decide to open a restaurant at this stage in my life. I could have offered a polished explanation about chasing dreams or embracing reinvention. Instead, I held his gaze and told him the truth. I explained that my son and his wife had thrown me out of my own house the previous week, packed my belongings into garbage bags, and informed me that I was too old to live comfortably among decent people. So I had decided it was time to demonstrate exactly what this so-called old woman could accomplish. The room fell silent. Catherine smiled like a shark scenting blood. Adrian carefully set down his coffee cup, and finally remarked that the strongest businesses are often built on revenge. By the time I left that meeting, I had a signed lease agreement, a practical timeline of 16 weeks for renovations and opening, and something unexpected: Adrian's business card, his personal number written on the back. He had said it was in case I needed anything, his fingers brushing mine as he handed it over, emphasizing that he meant anything at all. I drove back to my studio apartment feeling entirely different from the woman who had left that morning. I had direction now. I had purpose. And if I was honest, I also felt the first faint stirrings of attraction I had experienced since my husband passed away 5 years earlier. As I heated a frozen dinner, my phone buzzed. Kevin's name appeared on the screen. I let the call go to voicemail and played the message on speaker while eating my unimpressive portion of teriyaki chicken. He explained that Lauren had told him I had stopped by the house and mentioned that I seemed upset about paperwork. He suggested that there had been a misunderstanding, and said we needed to talk so that things could be resolved. It was interesting how quickly a calculated eviction transformed into a misunderstanding once legal documents were involved. I deleted the message before finishing my dinner. There had been no misunderstanding. There had been a revelation, and the distinction mattered. The following morning, I returned to the strip mall and walked through what would soon become my restaurant with a contractor Catherine had recommended. The space was larger than it appeared from the outside, 1,500 square feet, with a small kitchen in the back and room for about 40 seats. It required work, but it had good bones, as my grandmother used to say. The contractor explained that we could be operational within 16 weeks, outlining renovations, kitchen equipment installation, permits, health department approvals, everything required. He mentioned that Catherine had allocated a generous budget. As he discussed flooring and fixtures, my attention drifted toward the front window. Directly across the street, Lauren's boutique was opening for the day. She was arranging clothes in the display window, moving with the determined busyness of someone who believed she was building an empire rather than staging dress-up with borrowed resources. The view was perfect. Absolutely perfect. There is nothing quite like a front-row seat to watch karma unfold. Construction began on a Tuesday, which meant Lauren had an unobstructed view of my resurrection. I made a point of arriving every morning at 7, coffee in hand, observing the contractors remove anything that did not serve my purpose. It felt symbolic, much like what I was doing with my own life. Adrian stopped by most days, always with a practical excuse about checking electrical work or reviewing lease details. One afternoon he arrived carrying lunch, real lunch, from an upscale deli downtown, a significant improvement from the gas station sandwiches I had been surviving on. I told him he did not need to feed me, even as I unwrapped what appeared to be the most perfectly assembled turkey club I had ever seen. He responded that he was fully aware he did not have to, but he wanted to, and that there was a difference. We ate together in comfortable silence while the sounds of renovation continued around us. The space was already beginning to transform. Warm honey-colored wood covered the floors, a deep green coated the accent wall, and the industrial light fixtures somehow managed to look both modern and timeless at once. Adrian suddenly asked about my marriage, then immediately apologized for overstepping. He explained that Catherine had mentioned I had been married for a long time. I told him it had been 38 years. Frank had died 5 years ago. Cancer. Slow and unforgiving. I did not usually speak about it, but with Adrian the words felt easier. I told him Frank had been steady and kind, that we had built a quiet life together. Nothing dramatic, just solid and real. He said that sounded nice, almost wistful. Then he shared that his wife had left him 2 years earlier. She had told him he was boring. Apparently, spending 40 years building a real estate empire had not been exciting enough for her. She had wanted adventure, passion, something dramatic. He laughed, but there was bitterness underneath. She had found that adventure with his business partner, and now they were living in Costa Rica on money that had once been half his. I told him I was sorry. He said not to be. In his view, it had been the best thing that ever happened to him, even if it had not felt that way at the time. Sometimes, he said, losing everything forces you to discover what you actually want. He glanced around the construction zone approvingly, then asked how my son was handling my new venture. I pulled out my phone and showed him the call log. 23 missed calls from Kevin in the past 2 weeks. I admitted that Kevin was persistent. Adrian asked if I had spoken to him. I said there was nothing left to discuss. Kevin had made his position clear, and now I was making mine. I took another bite of the sandwich, which was easily the best meal I had eaten in weeks. I added that I was too busy building a business to entertain apologies. Adrian smiled, not politely but warmly. He said he believed my son had made the biggest mistake of his life by underestimating me. I told him he was not alone in that mistake. I had been underestimating myself for quite some time as well. That afternoon, I began to understand just how serious Kevin's mistake truly was. Catherine arrived carrying a folder thick with paperwork and wearing a smile that should have come with a warning. She suggested we sit in my car so we could watch the construction and speak privately about Kevin and his startup. She told me she had hired a private investigator to make some inquiries. What he discovered was worse than she had expected. Kevin was not merely struggling. He was collapsing financially. He owed money to investors, vendors, and even former employees. Within a month, the company would likely be officially bankrupt. I felt something twist inside me. Part satisfaction, part grief. I asked how she knew all this. She explained that she paid people to know things. She also admitted that she had been considering investing in that particular market space. Distressed assets, she said, can be extremely profitable if handled correctly. The meaning settled over me slowly. I asked what she was planning. She assured me it would be nothing illegal and nothing unethical, simply justice. Then she pulled a document from the folder and told me Kevin had been using my house as collateral for his business loans. She asked if I had known. My blood ran cold. She clarified that for the past 2 years, Kevin had allegedly been forging my signature on financial documents, using my property to secure funding. When the company failed, and she was certain it would, creditors would pursue whatever assets had been pledged. The folder felt heavier in my hands. She confirmed that included my house, unless someone with stronger financial resources and better legal representation intervened first. The next morning, I walked into the law office of Linda Carver carrying that folder and a fury so controlled it could have powered a small city. Linda, Catherine's attorney, was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who specialized in what she called family asset protection, and what I was beginning to think of as reclaiming what belonged to me. After reviewing the documents Catherine had gathered, Linda stated that this was clear, documentable fraud. My son had been using my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent. At minimum, she said, it constituted forgery. Depending on the total amount involved, it could rise to criminal misrepresentation. I asked how much money we were discussing. She consulted her notes and explained that, according to the investigation Catherine commissioned, approximately $200,000 in secured debt had been placed against my property. The number struck me physically. $200,000. More than I had earned in 5 years at the diner. More than the original purchase price of my home. I asked how that was even possible. Linda explained that banks do not always verify signatures as carefully as they should, particularly when the collateral is significant and the borrower appears credible. Her tone carried the weary frustration of someone who had seen this scenario far too many times. Linda said my son was charismatic, well-educated, and that he had been working this system for 2 years. I asked what my options were. She explained that legally we could file a fraud complaint, freeze the assets, and let the courts untangle everything. She warned it could take years, and by the time it was finished I might lose the house anyway just paying legal fees. Then she leaned back in her chair and said there was another route. I asked what she meant. She said we could get creative. I asked how. She looked at Catherine and asked whether I had been told about the offer. I glanced between them, realizing I was clearly missing something. I asked what offer. Catherine spoke for the first time since we had sat down. She said she was prepared to buy my house from me for full market value, with a cash closing in 45 days. She explained that I would walk away free and clear of all Kevin's debts. I would have enough capital to fully fund the restaurant and still have a significant nest egg. I asked where I would live. Catherine's smile brightened. She explained that Adrian had a carriage house behind his main property. It was fully furnished, private, and he had offered it to me as part of a property management arrangement. In exchange for overseeing his rental properties and scheduling maintenance, I would receive housing and a modest salary. The pieces began falling into place with mathematical precision. Linda added calmly that Kevin would come home one day to discover his house had been sold out from under him, just as he had effectively taken mine from me. She remarked that some people might call that poetic justice. I sat in silence for a long moment, considering what they were proposing. It was elegant. It was complete. It was ruthless. Catherine then said there was one more thing. She had been thinking about the restaurant's name. I asked what about it. She said that given everything that had happened, given where I started and where I was heading, she believed it should be called Second Chances. She asked what I thought. I pictured Kevin sitting in his borrowed office making promises he could not keep with money he did not have. I imagined Lauren arranging clothes in her boutique window, unaware of the storm coming. I remembered the garbage bags, the dismissive tone, the casual cruelty of being declared too old to matter. I said slowly that it sounded perfect. Linda was already reaching for her phone and said she would call the title company so the papers could be ready by the next day. Even as I nodded, my phone buzzed with a text from Kevin asking me to call him because there was something important he needed to tell me. Too little, too late, I thought. But the desperation in his message made me wonder what other surprises he had waiting. Knowing Kevin, it would probably make forging my signature seem like a minor administrative issue. I called him back from the parking lot of Linda's office, with Catherine and Linda standing nearby as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. He answered on the first ring. He sounded relieved and asked where I had been, saying he had been trying to reach me for days. His voice carried the same strain I remembered from his teenage years when he had been caught in a lie. I told him I had been busy building a life and suggested he try doing the same. I put the call on speaker so my allies could hear. He rushed through his explanation, asking me not to overreact. He said there might be some paperwork issues involving the house. He claimed certain documents had become mixed up while he was trying to help manage my finances. I reflected on how considerate that sounded. I asked him to explain what he meant by mixed up. After a long pause, he admitted that he might have used the house as collateral for some business loans, but insisted it was temporary. He claimed the company was about to receive a large investment, and that everything would be cleared up within the month. I repeated the word accidentally in a flat tone. Linda raised her eyebrows. Catherine looked delighted. More than anger, I felt tired. Then I asked him quietly whether he had forged my signature. He said he would not describe it that way. He claimed he had only been trying to help both of us. According to him, I needed someone to manage my financial affairs, and he needed short-term funding. How noble, I thought, stealing from his mother to keep his failing business afloat. They ought to hand out humanitarian awards for that level of generosity. I asked him again whether he had forged my signature. There was another pause. Longer this time. He finally admitted that he had, but insisted he could fix everything. He began rambling about investors who were supposedly interested in funding that was just around the corner. I ended the call before he could finish and looked at Linda. I said that sounded very much like a confession. Linda confirmed that it was recorded and witnessed, and that it was more than sufficient for what we needed. The sale of the house proceeded with legal precision over the next 6 weeks. I signed the paperwork in Linda's office while Kevin was somewhere across town trying to explain to his creditors why the collateral they believed they had was no longer available. Catherine had structured the transaction flawlessly. She purchased the property through one of her shell companies, cleared the liens, and left Kevin with nothing but a collapsing business and debt he could no longer shield behind my assets. I moved into Adrian's carriage house that weekend. It felt like stepping into a fairy tale after months in that cramped studio apartment. There were 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, hardwood floors, and windows overlooking gardens. Adrian tended himself. He insisted on helping me carry in my boxes, which was unnecessary but provided an excuse for us to share the same space. He explained that the property management responsibilities were fairly light, mostly coordinating maintenance for his 3 rental properties and handling tenant concerns when they arose. Nothing overwhelming. I asked what the catch was because in my experience arrangements that generous always carried hidden costs. He leaned against the doorway and studied me with those steady dark eyes. He said there was no catch. He simply did not enjoy the quiet of living alone. Something warm stirred in my chest. I told him I made excellent coffee. He said he had been hoping I would say that. The restaurant opened 16 weeks later on a crisp October morning. Every permit was properly filed. Every health department requirement had been met. Catherine had invited half the town. Adrian had persuaded nearly every business owner in the district to attend. And I had carefully scheduled the opening to coincide with Lauren's lunch break, so she would have a clear view. The first customer to walk in was Judith Whitaker, a 75-year-old retired principal who lived in Adrian's neighborhood. She ordered the meatloaf special and declared it better than her grandmother's, which was high praise considering that woman had fed 8 children during the Depression. By noon there was a line out the door. Real customers, not just the supportive crowd Catherine had worried about. People ordered second helpings, asked about catering, and snapped photos for social media. The register rang constantly, and I smiled until my cheeks ached. Catherine appeared beside me during a brief pause and asked whether I saw the woman in the red coat near the window. I followed her gaze. A stylish brunette in her 60s was carefully photographing her salmon salad. Catherine explained that she was a food blogger and critic, Victoria Langley from the Metro Weekly, the kind of reviewer who could make or break a restaurant. She had been seated for 40 minutes, which Catherine considered a very good sign. Through the front window, I saw Lauren standing in the doorway of her boutique, watching the crowd with an expression that suggested something unpleasant had soured in her mouth. A small, uncharitable part of me hoped the critic noticed the contrast. A full dining room versus an empty shop of overpriced clothing and misplaced arrogance. Success is difficult to witness when you have already dismissed someone as irrelevant. Adrian appeared in the kitchen doorway and asked if I needed help. I pointed out that he did not know how to cook, yet I was already tying an apron around his waist. Having him near felt unexpectedly natural. He said he could follow instructions and told me to direct him. We moved through the lunch rush together as though we had been doing it for years rather than hours. He turned out to be surprisingly competent at plating salads and tracking orders. More importantly, he kept me laughing when the tickets began stacking up. As he passed behind me with a tray of clean plates, he warned me softly and added a compliment that made me blush like a teenager. The critic left without introducing herself, which Catherine assured me was typical. We would learn her opinion when the review appeared the following week, but the rest of the day was undeniably successful. We served 97 customers, sold out of 3 menu items, and booked reservations through the following weekend. That evening, while tallying receipts, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered with the restaurant's greeting. It was Kevin. He said he had seen the restaurant online and that it looked impressive. I thanked him. He then mentioned that he had been served papers regarding the house fraud, and that Linda Carver was representing me. I confirmed that she was. There was a long silence. Then he apologized. He said he knew it did not undo anything, but he was sorry and had never intended for the situation to spiral so badly. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the successful business I had built from nothing. At the life I was building for myself at 68. I told him that I knew he had not meant for things to become this bad. He had meant for them to stay hidden. He started to object, then stopped. After a moment, he admitted I was right. That was exactly what he had intended. I asked whether he needed something or if he was simply calling to apologize. He said Lauren had left him. The words rushed out. She had told him she could not stay married to someone facing criminal charges. She packed most of their belongings and moved back in with her mother. Well, that was predictable. Lauren's devotion had always seemed directly tied to financial stability. Once that disappeared, so did she. I felt a brief flicker of something that might have been sympathy. I told him I was sorry to hear that. He asked if I truly was. He laughed bitterly and said I had never liked her. I clarified that I had not hated her. I had simply seen her clearly. I closed the cash drawer with more force than necessary and asked again whether he was calling to ask for something or to make amends. He said he wanted to make amends and fix everything. I told him to begin by pleading guilty to the fraud charges and repaying every dollar he had taken. After that, we could discuss amends. The line went silent. Finally, he said his lawyers believed that if he pleaded guilty, he would almost certainly go to jail. I reminded him that he had forged my signature and stolen $200,000. That was not a small mistake. I ended the call and locked the restaurant door behind me. Across the street, Lauren's boutique was dark. A for lease sign had already been taped inside the window. Apparently, she had decided to cut her losses before Kevin's legal troubles damaged her reputation. As I walked home to Adrian's carriage house, I reflected that justice sometimes looks like an empty storefront and unpaid bills. The review was published the following Thursday morning. 5 stars. A glowing write-up that described me as some sort of culinary visionary rather than a former diner waitress who had learned to cook out of necessity. It said that Second Chances delivered exactly what its name promised. Comfort food elevated into something meaningful, served with genuine hospitality. Catherine framed the article and hung it by the front door. Adrian brought champagne. The phone rang all day with reservation requests. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I stood in my kitchen at home, staring at an official-looking letter forwarded from my old address. The return address belonged to a law firm I did not recognize. It was from Kevin's criminal defense attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss potential resolution options that might benefit everyone involved. In other words, they wanted to negotiate. I was still holding the letter when Adrian knocked on the back door. He asked why I had missed our evening walk, then saw my expression and immediately understood something was wrong. I handed him the letter without speaking. He read it twice and his face hardened. He asked whether I was actually considering it. I admitted I did not know. I sat down heavily and said that Kevin was still my son. Yes, he had betrayed me. Yes, he had stolen from me. But he was still my child. Adrian sat across from me and took my hands. He asked what I believed would happen if I dropped the charges. I said that perhaps Kevin would rebuild his life, learn from his mistakes, and appreciate a second chance. Adrian asked what might happen to the next elderly person Kevin decided to help with finances. The question landed hard. I had been thinking of Kevin as my son, not as someone capable of exploiting vulnerable people. I asked whether he thought Kevin had done something like this before. Adrian replied gently that people who forge signatures for $200,000 rarely begin with their own mothers. He added that dropping the charges would send a message that elder abuse is acceptable, as long as an apology follows. That night I called Linda and asked her to arrange the meeting with Kevin's lawyer. Not because I intended to accept a deal, but because I wanted to hear what they believed my son's freedom was worth. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday morning. Catherine offered to attend as support. Adrian offered to take time off work. I told them I needed to handle it alone. Kevin's attorney was a smooth-talking man in his 40s who likely billed more per hour than I once earned in a month at the diner. The kind of lawyer who could reframe armed robbery as community service. He presented their proposal with confident ease. Kevin would plead guilty to a misdemeanor fraud charge, repay the money over 5 years, and accept 3 years of probation. In exchange, I would agree to drop the felony charges. He would also sign a statement accepting responsibility and acknowledging the harm caused. If I refused, the lawyer explained, we would proceed to trial. It could take months, cost significant legal fees, and there was no absolute guarantee of a felony conviction. I studied him carefully and asked where Kevin was in all of this. Did he not wish to speak for himself? The lawyer replied that his client believed it would be more productive for the negotiations to be handled professionally. Of course he did. Even now, staring at the possibility of prison, Kevin could not be bothered to face me himself. He preferred to hide behind attorneys and let other people attempt to repair the damage he created. Some things never change, including my son's lifelong resistance to personal responsibility. I told the lawyer I would consider the offer, and that he would have my answer by Friday. But I already knew what that answer would be. Friday arrived gray and drizzling, which felt fitting. I had asked Linda to arrange a conference call with Kevin's attorney at 10 o'clock. Catherine and Adrian both offered to sit with me for support, but I needed to do this alone. At exactly 10 my phone rang. Kevin's lawyer asked whether I had reached a decision regarding their proposal. I said I had and that the answer was no. There was a pause. He asked me to repeat myself. I told him clearly that I would not be dropping the charges against my son. My voice was steady. I had rehearsed this moment for days. Kevin would face the consequences of his actions in court. He suggested I might be acting emotionally, and proposed arranging another meeting so Kevin could speak with me directly. I reminded him that my son had 43 years to speak to me directly, and had chosen instead to forge my signature. I glanced out my kitchen window at the restaurant, where the lunch crowd was beginning to gather. I explained that this was not an emotional decision. It was a business decision. He questioned what I meant. I said Kevin had stolen from me, but more than that, he had forced me to confront my own worth and the consequences of allowing love to excuse exploitation. That morning, Catherine had shown me a newspaper clipping. 6 other cases of elderly fraud in this county during the past year, all involving family members. There was silence on the other end of the line. I told him I would not enable my son to harm anyone else the way he had harmed me. That was not love. It was cowardice. He warned me that if the case went to trial, Kevin could face 5 to 10 years in prison. I said perhaps he should have considered that before committing fraud. I ended the call and immediately contacted Linda to confirm we were proceeding to trial. 20 minutes later, just as I was preparing to leave for the restaurant, Kevin called me directly. He pleaded with me not to do this. I told him I was not doing anything to him. He had done this to himself. He said 5 years in prison would take 5 years of his life for one mistake. I reminded him that $200,000 in forged documents was not one mistake. It was 200,000 separate decisions. He was crying now. He said he had been desperate. The business was collapsing. Lauren was threatening to leave. He claimed he had not been thinking clearly and had never meant to hurt me. I reminded him that he had hurt me. He had thrown me out like garbage. He had told me I was too old to live with decent people. He admitted he had been wrong and begged me not to send him to prison. He promised to repay every dollar and do whatever I asked. I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of maternal instinct battling everything I had learned about myself in the past months. I asked him what he would do if someone stole $200,000 from his children. He said that was different. I asked how. He faltered. I suggested that perhaps he believed I mattered less, that my age made my money less important, that being my son entitled him to take what he wanted. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally he said he loved me. I told him I loved him too, and that was precisely why I would not enable him to harm anyone else. This time after ending the call I turned off my phone. I had a restaurant to run, a life to live and a future to build. For the first time in months that future felt entirely mine. The trial took place 6 months later and lasted 3 days. Kevin pleaded not guilty despite the overwhelming evidence, apparently hoping a jury would sympathize with a son who claimed he had only been trying to help his elderly mother manage her finances. His original high-priced attorney had withdrawn after the plea deal collapsed. The defense painted me as a vindictive old woman punishing her son for misguided generosity. I sat in the front row each day, listening as my son lied under oath about his motives and my mental capacity. Catherine sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand when the testimony became particularly harsh. Adrian sat behind us, steady and present. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. Forged signatures on loan documents dating back 2 years, $200,000 in fraudulent loans, and the recorded confession from the call I had made outside Linda's office. They also demonstrated the pattern, how the financial abuse had begun small before escalating. It had started small. A credit card here. A bank transfer there. Then it grew until he was using my house as collateral for his failing business. But the moment everything truly collapsed came when the prosecutor called Lauren to the stand. My former daughter-in-law walked into that courtroom as if she were attending a charity luncheon. Perfectly dressed. Perfectly composed. She took the oath with the same polished sweetness she had used when she told me I was too old to live in my own home. It was remarkable how someone could look so refined while preparing to dismantle her husband's defense. The prosecutor confirmed that she had been married to Kevin for 2 years. She answered yes. He asked whether Kevin had ever discussed my finances with her during that time. Lauren glanced at Kevin, who was staring down at the table as though it might offer an escape. She admitted that he had spoken about my money. The prosecutor asked what he had said. She hesitated, then repeated his words. He had said I was sitting on a gold mine and did not even realize it. That the house was worth a fortune and that I was too old to enjoy it anyway. The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor asked whether Kevin had ever discussed plans to access that money. This time Lauren's composure cracked. She said he had remarked that I would not live forever, and that someone needed to ensure my assets were managed properly. He had described himself as accelerating the inevitable. He believed that since I would leave everything to him eventually, it did not matter if he borrowed against it now. I felt the air leave my lungs. He had not simply stolen from me in desperation. He had been planning to steal from me, possibly for years. Later, Catherine explained that Lauren had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. She had known about the fraud and remained silent, making her legally vulnerable. The prosecution had offered her a choice: testify against Kevin or face charges herself. The defense attempted to recover on cross-examination, but the damage had already been done. Lauren's testimony was too detailed and too precise. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she did not look at Kevin. She did not look at me. She simply walked out, as though exiting our lives for good. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Kevin was sentenced to 7 years, with the possibility of parole after 5. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked at me one last time. There was no anger in his expression, no resentment, only something that might have been understanding. He said he was sorry. I told him I knew he was and that I was sorry too. Outside the courthouse, Catherine and Adrian walked beside me while reporters shouted questions about elder abuse and family betrayal. I ignored them and moved steadily toward Adrian's car, my head held high. Catherine asked how I felt. I considered it carefully. I was sad. I was relieved. But there was something else. Free. That night, Adrian and I sat on his back porch sharing a bottle of wine while the stars appeared overhead. The restaurant was closed on Mondays, which gave us the rare gift of quiet time together. He asked whether I regretted it. I said no and surprised myself with how true that felt. I regretted that it had come to this. I regretted the choices Kevin had made. But I did not regret standing up for myself. Adrian took my hand and said he believed I was the strongest person he had ever known. I laughed and reminded him that 6 months earlier I had been living out of garbage bags because I had been too afraid to challenge my own son. He corrected me firmly. He said that 6 months earlier I had been grieving, trusting, and hoping my family would treat me with love. That was not weakness. That was human. Strength, he said, was what I did once I realized they would not. We sat quietly, watching lights flicker on in the surrounding houses. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, likely assuming their children would never forge their signatures or their spouses would never walk away when things became inconvenient. What a luxury that must be. Then Adrian said he had something to tell me. My stomach tightened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart seemed to stop. He acknowledged that it had only been 6 months and that we were both still adjusting. But he said he had not felt this happy in years, and did not want to waste whatever time we had left being cautious. He opened the box. Inside was a simple diamond ring. Elegant. Classic. Perfect. He explained that he was not asking me to marry him immediately. He was asking whether I would consider building whatever came next together. I looked at the ring, then at him, then back at the ring. 8 months earlier, I had been a discarded mother living on scraps of affection from people who saw me as a burden. Now I was a successful business owner being asked to share a future with a man who believed I was worth choosing. I said yes, laughing through unexpected tears. I told him I would very much like to build whatever came next together. As he slid the ring onto my finger, I thought about second chances, about beginnings that arrive disguised as endings, about how life can surprise you when you believe your story is finished. I had been wrong about many things, but I had been right about one. Sometimes the best revenge truly is living well. Thank you for listening. Do not forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.